In the winter of 1908, 8-year-old Margaret Holloway walked into her family's kitchen with dirt under her fingernails and something terrible in her hands. Her mother screamed when she saw what the child had brought from the frozen cemetery behind their Pennsylvania farmhouse. Margaret smiled and whispered that Grandmama and Grandpapa had been calling to her from beneath the ground for weeks. They wanted to come home for Christmas. What happened next would haunt the Holloway family for generations and leave an entire town asking one horrifying question. What drives a child to dig up the dead in the dead of winter? The Holloway farm sat on 40 acres of bitter Pennsylvania soil, 3 miles outside the coal town of Millfield. The house had been in the family for 3 generations, built by Margaret's great-grandfather in 1847. Behind the farmhouse, past the withering apple orchard, lay the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by a wrought iron fence where the Holloways buried their own. December 1908 brought the harshest winter anyone could remember. Snow piled 8 feet high against the farmhouse walls. The coal mines shut down for 2 weeks straight. Families huddled around their stoves, burning furniture when the coal ran out. But the Holloway house felt different that winter. Colder somehow, even with fires burning in every room. Margaret's grandparents had died just 6 months earlier. First grandmother Edith in July, taken by consumption. Then grandfather Thomas in September, his heart giving out from grief, the doctor said. The old couple had raised Margaret when her own parents worked the mines. She spent every day with them, learning to read from grandmother's Bible, helping grandfather tend his vegetable garden. The child took their deaths harder than anyone expected. She stopped eating, stopped playing with her wooden dolls. Every evening she stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the cemetery. Her mother, Sarah, found her there one night in November, pressing her small hands against the cold glass. "They're calling me," Margaret whispered. "Can't you hear them?" Sarah heard nothing but wind rattling the shutters. The first sign of trouble came on December 10th. Sarah woke to find Margaret's bed empty. She searched the house, calling the child's name. Then she saw the back door standing wide open, letting in the bitter cold. Footprints in the snow led straight to the cemetery. Sarah found Margaret kneeling beside her grandparents' graves, scraping at the frozen ground with her bare hands. Her fingers were blue with cold, bleeding from the effort. She looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "They're so cold down there," Margaret said. "They want to come inside where it's warm." Sarah dragged the child back to the house, but Margaret fought her every step. She screamed that her grandparents needed her help, that they were scared and alone in the dark ground. Sarah locked the back door that night and hid the key. It didn't matter. 3 days later, Margaret found another way out. This time, Sarah's husband James discovered what their daughter had done. He came home from checking on the livestock to find Margaret in the kitchen, carefully washing something in the sink. When he looked closer, he saw what it was. A human finger bone, dirt still clinging to the joints. James grabbed his daughter's shoulders. "Where did you get this?" Margaret pointed toward the cemetery. "Grandpapa gave it to me. He said I could keep it until spring when the ground gets soft again." The parents searched Margaret's room and found more bones hidden beneath her bed. Small pieces at first, finger bones, a few teeth. But as the days passed, Margaret brought back larger remains. A rib cage that she arranged carefully on her dresser like a decoration, part of a skull that she talked to like an old friend. Each night, Margaret slipped out of the house despite her parents' efforts to keep her inside. They nailed boards over windows, changed locks on doors. Nothing worked. The child always found a way to reach the cemetery, and each morning she returned with more pieces of her grandparents. If you're enjoying this terrifying tale, hit that subscribe button now because the story gets much darker from here. The townspeople started talking by Christmas Eve. James made the mistake of asking the local doctor for help, thinking perhaps Margaret had some kind of sickness of the mind. Word spread quickly through Millfield. People whispered about the Holloway child who dug up graves like a wild animal. On Christmas morning, Margaret arranged her collection of bones on the kitchen table like presents. She had pieced together almost complete skeletons, working with the careful precision of a trained undertaker. The bones were clean now, washed and dried. She had even tied red ribbons around some of the larger pieces. "Look," she told her parents with genuine joy. "They came home for Christmas just like they promised." Sarah collapsed into a chair, unable to look at the horrible display. But James noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bones were too clean, too perfectly preserved, as if they hadn't been buried in wet winter ground for months, as if they had been kept somewhere dry and safe. That's when James realized his daughter hadn't been digging up graves at all. He followed Margaret's footprints in the snow one more time, but this time he looked more carefully. The tracks didn't lead to the cemetery. They led to the old root cellar behind the house. The wooden door hung open, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. James lit a lantern and went down. What he found at the bottom made him understand why his daughter's eyes had looked so strange for months. Why she seemed to know things no child should know. His parents weren't buried in the cemetery at all. They were sitting in chairs in the root cellar, perfectly preserved by the cold. Their bodies were frozen solid, their dead eyes staring straight ahead. Someone had been bringing them food. Someone had been talking to them. Someone had been carefully removing small pieces of their flesh and bone, keeping them like treasures. Margaret had been living with the corpses of her grandparents for months. The graves in the cemetery were empty. Had always been empty. She had convinced the gravedigger, old Pete Morrison, to help her move the bodies before the burial. Pete was simple-minded, and Margaret was clever for her age. She told him her grandparents wanted to spend winter in the warm cellar, not the cold ground. Pete helped her carry the bodies down those stone steps. Then Margaret had somehow convinced him never to speak of it. Maybe she promised him something. Maybe she threatened him. An 8-year-old girl shouldn't have that kind of power over a grown man. But Margaret wasn't like other children anymore. When James confronted his daughter, she didn't deny what she had done. Instead, she looked at him with those strange, old eyes and smiled. "They taught me things," she said. "Grandmama showed me how to keep people from rotting. Grandpapa taught me which bones carry the most power. They've been teaching me all winter." James asked what kind of power. Margaret picked up one of the finger bones from the table. She whispered something to it in a language James didn't recognize. The bone began to glow with a soft, sickly light. Then it started to move, curling and uncurling like a living thing. "They're not really dead," Margaret explained. "Death is just sleeping, and I know how to wake people up." The local preacher, Reverend Matthews, came to the house that evening after James sent word about what had happened. The Reverend was a practical man who didn't believe in superstition. He took one look at Margaret's bone collection and declared it all nonsense. Children had active imaginations, he said. The bones were probably just animal remains. But when Reverend Matthews touched one of the skull fragments, it whispered his name. The preacher stumbled backward, his face white with terror. The bone continued whispering, telling him secrets about his own past. Things nobody else could possibly know. Things he had never confessed to anyone. Margaret watched the adult world collapse around her with calm satisfaction. She had learned something important during those cold winter months in the cellar with her grandparents' corpses. Death wasn't the end of anything. It was just a different kind of beginning. And she was very good at beginnings. The authorities came to remove her grandparents' bodies from the cellar. Margaret didn't fight them this time. She simply watched from the kitchen window as they carried the corpses away. She still had dozens of bones hidden throughout the house. Pieces they would never find. Pieces that still whispered to her when the wind was right. That spring, strange things began happening around the Holloway farm. Crops grew in perfect circles where nothing had been planted. Animals gave birth to offspring that looked wrong somehow, with too many legs or eyes that glowed in the dark. Children from neighboring farms started sleepwalking toward the Holloway property in the middle of the night. Margaret grew taller that year, but not in a natural way. Her limbs stretched like someone was pulling on them. Her hair turned white at the roots. Her skin became so pale you could see the veins underneath. She still looked like a child, but something else lived behind her eyes now. The townspeople wanted the family to leave. They offered to buy the farm at twice its value, just to get the Holloways away from Millfield. But Margaret refused to go. The land was hers now, she said. Her grandparents had given it to her during those long winter conversations in the cellar. By autumn, Margaret's parents had aged 20 years in 6 months. Sarah's hair turned completely gray. James developed a tremor in his hands that never went away. They both began talking to empty rooms, having conversations with people who weren't there, or people who were there but couldn't be seen by normal eyes. The last anyone saw of the Holloway family was on Halloween night, 1909. A neighbor spotted lights moving through the cemetery behind their house. Not lantern light. Something else. Something that pulsed and shifted like it was alive. When dawn came, the Holloway house stood empty. The front door hung open. Inside, investigators found the kitchen table set for 4 people, but only one meal had been touched. Margaret's plate was clean. The other 3 plates held food that had rotted into something unrecognizable. In Margaret's bedroom, they discovered her journal. The entries began normal enough, written in a child's careful handwriting. But as the pages continued, the writing changed. The letters grew sharper, more angular. The words became harder to read, as if written by someone with too many fingers. The final entry was dated October 30th, 1909. They're all awake now. Grandmama and Grandpapa brought friends from the other side. Mama and Papa are learning to sleep the way I learned to wake things up. Tomorrow we start digging up the whole cemetery. There are so many people waiting to come home. The Holloway farm stayed empty for decades. Local kids dared each other to spend nights there, but most couldn't make it past the front gate. Those who did claimed they heard voices coming from the root cellar. Children's laughter mixing with the whispers of very old, very angry, dead things. In 1954, a developer bought the property to build houses. The first thing they did was tear down the old farmhouse. Underneath the kitchen floor, they found bones. Not human bones exactly, but something close. Something that had been human once, but changed into something else. The bones were arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The strangest part was what they found in the root cellar. 4 chairs arranged in a circle. On each chair sat a pile of clothes, neatly folded. The clothes looked like they belonged to the Holloway family, but they were decades too new, as if someone had been buying fresh clothes for people who no longer needed them. But the chairs weren't empty. Workers reported seeing impressions in the seats, as if invisible people were sitting there. One contractor swore he heard breathing coming from the chairs when the wind was still. Another claimed he saw a small hand reach out from nowhere to adjust the collar on a woman's dress. The development was never finished. Workers kept quitting after spending just 1 day on the property. Heavy machinery broke down without explanation. Foundation holes filled themselves with black water overnight. And every morning someone found fresh flowers placed on the 4 chairs in the root cellar. Margaret would be over 50 now, if she was still alive in any way that mattered. But age works differently for people who learn to wake up the dead. Time moves strangely around them. They stop following the same rules as everyone else. Some say she never left the farm at all, that she's still down in that root cellar, sitting in her chair, surrounded by all the friends she collected over the decades. People who went missing in Millfield. People who disappeared while driving past the old Holloway property. People who were too curious about the girl who dug up her grandparents. The cellar is still there, hidden now beneath 50 years of overgrown weeds and collapsed timber. But sometimes, on winter nights when the ground freezes hard, locals report seeing a soft glow coming from somewhere underground. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of small hands digging in frozen soil. Because Margaret learned something that winter in 1908. Something her grandparents taught her during those long, cold conversations. The dead don't stay buried if someone remembers how to call them home. And some children are very, very good at remembering. The development company still owns the Holloway property, though they've given up trying to build on it. They keep it gated now, with no trespassing signs that get replaced every few months after someone tears them down. But the gates don't really keep anyone out. They keep something in. Last month, a jogger found fresh bones scattered along the road that borders the old farm, small bones, the size a child might collect. The police investigated but found no signs of recent digging. No disturbed graves, just bones that seemed to appear from nowhere, arranged in patterns that made people uncomfortable to look at. Margaret Holloway would be celebrating her 124th birthday this December, and according to the locals who still whisper about that terrible winter in 1908, she's planning something special for the anniversary, something involving all the friends she's been collecting in her underground parlor for over a century. The question isn't whether Margaret is still alive down there in the dark. The question is what happens when she finally decides to bring all her friends home for Christmas, just like she did with her grandparents all those years ago. Because the child who learned to wake up the dead never really learned when to stop.